In the 1800s, Texas was a wild and lawless place, attracting all manner of thieves, murderers, and other ruthless outlaws. To combat these many desperados and fight the Indians, who were prone to attacking the white settlers, in rode the Texas Rangers, who set about in taming the wild Texas frontier. The Rio Grande to the south had been declared the border between the United States and Mexico. However, the Mexican government refused to recognize the boundary, insisting instead that the Nueces River was the border. This left a giant chunk of land between the two rivers, which became known as No Man's Land and a prime target for outlaws. The dispute between the two countries finally forced the United States to go to war with Mexico in 1846 to make the Rio Grande the official border. However, it would take another 30 years before the Texas Rangers could rid the territory of the Mexican cattle rustlers and thieves. The Texas Rangers, an intense posse of expert gunmen, were not meant to be messed with. Following their adversaries everywhere, they lived out of the saddle and often dispensed justice brutally. Two of these men were Creed Taylor and William Alexander Anderson Bigfoot Wallace, who himself a folk hero. It was Bigfoot, with Creed's blessing, who unwittingly created El Muerto. In 1850, a man known simply as Vidal was busy rustling cattle all over South Texas, and soon he had a high price on his head, dead or alive. During that summer, Vidal took advantage of a Comanche raid, which pulled most of the men northward to fight off the attack. In the meantime, the sparse settlements were temporarily left unguarded. Vidal, along with 3 of his henchmen, wasted no time in taking advantage of the situation and gathering up a considerable number of horses on the San Antonio River, heading southwest toward Mexico. What Vidal didn't know was that among the stolen herd were several prized Mustangs belonging to Texas Ranger Creed Taylor, usually one of the first to defend the settlements against Indian attacks, who had not on this occasion gone after the Comanche. Creed's ranch lay west of San Antonio, in the thickest of bandit country, not far from the headwaters of the Nueces River. Due to the location of the ranch, Taylor's livestock and horses were often the targets of the many bandits. Taylor had had enough and quickly gathered fellow ranger Bigfoot Wallace and a nearby rancher by the name of Flores. Both Wallace and Taylor were as skilled as any Comanche when tracking, and the 3 men shortly found the trail of Vidal and his henchmen. When the 3 men found the outlaw camp, they waited until night when the bandits were sleeping to attack. Catching them unaware, the thieves were killed. But just killing them wasn't enough. Taylor and Wallace wanted to set an example that would deter future bandits. In those days, stealing cattle and horses was a crime much more serious than murder. The Rangers had tried all types of brutal justice in the past, including stringing them up in trees and left hanging, shooting them, and chopping them into pieces, leaving their bodies for animal bait. But nothing had worked to stop the outlaws. In a dramatic example of frontier justice, Wallace beheaded Vidal, then lashed him firmly into a saddle on the back of a wild Mustang. Tying the outlaw's hands to the pommel and securing the torso to hold him upright, Bigfoot then attached Vidal's head and sombrero to the saddle with a long strip of rawhide. He then turned the bucking horse loose to wander the Texas hills with its terrible burden on his back. Soon, stories began to abound about the headless rider seen usually in remote country, with its sombreroed head swinging back and forth to the rhythm of the horse's gallop. As time went on, more and more cowboys spotted the dark horse with its fearsome cargo, and not knowing what it was, they riddled it with bullets. But the horse and its rider rode on, and the legend of El Muerto, the Headless One, began. Soon, the South Texas brush country became a place to avoid, as El Muerto was credited with all kinds of evil and misfortune. Finally, a posse of local ranchers captured the wild pony at a watering hole near the tiny community of Ben Bolt just south of Alice, Texas. Still strapped firmly on its back was the dried-up corpse of Vidal, now riddled by scores of bullet holes and Indian arrows. The body was buried in an unmarked grave near Ben Bolt, and the horse was free of its burden at last. That should have been the end of El Muerto, but the legend would live on to this day. Soon after Vidal's body was laid to rest, soldiers at Fort Ing, present-day Uvalde, began to see the headless rider. Travelers and ranchers in No Man's Land also reported continuing to see the apparition. In 1917, a couple traveling by covered wagon to San Diego, Texas, camped for the night outside of town. They would report the very next day that as they sat by the campfire, a large gray stallion sped by with a headless man shouting, "It is mine! It is all mine!" The legend lives on, and still today, many people report seeing the headless rider galloping through the mesquite on clear and moonlit nights in South Texas. If not for the Civil War and a Washington lobbying group, the Wild West might have been populated by camel boys instead of cowboys. When Edward Fitzgerald Beale, a Texas war veteran, saw how poorly horses fared in the deserts of the Southwest, he suggested importing camels. It was in 1855 that the idea first took off, under then Secretary of War Jefferson Davis. 2 years later, the U.S. military imported 75 camels and formed a U.S. Army Camel Corps. One group was stationed in Texas, and the other headed for California under Beale's command. But with the Civil War looming on the horizon, U.S. Congress was not inclined to pay for still more camels. Mule breeders fought the idea too, and when the fighting broke out, Confederate forces captured the Texas herd and let most of the camels loose. That's where things get interesting, because it turns out Beale and Davis were right. The camels really were exceptionally suited for the desert, and most cowboys had never seen the beasts, meaning that as they roamed Arizona and New Mexico until the late 1890s, they spawned a lot of strange tales. Take, for example, the Red Ghost. Settlers described it as a terrifying beast with some terrifying riders strapped to its back. According to the Smithsonian article, legend said that the ghost took down a bear and could disappear into thin air. But when the Red Ghost was finally caught, it was not by a hardy cowhand who tracked it through the desert, but by a rancher who had shot the beast in his tomato patch. That's when they discovered that the Red Ghost was just a mean, reddish feral camel and a lot of tall tales. All the camels were eventually captured or killed, and the last feral camel, Topsy, died in a Los Angeles zoo in 1934. The legend of La Llorona, Spanish for the Weeping Woman, has been a part of Southwest's Hispanic culture since the conquistadors' days. The tall, thin spirit is said to be blessed with natural beauty and long, flowing black hair. She wears a white gown and roams the rivers and creeks, wailing into the night and searching for children to drag away, screaming to a watery grave. No one knows when the legend of La Llorona began, or where it originated from. Though the tales vary from source to source, the common thread is that she is the spirit of a doomed mother who drowned her children and spends eternity searching for them in rivers and lakes. La Llorona, christened Maria, was born to a peasant family in a humble village. Her startling beauty captured the attention of the area's rich and poor men. She was said to have spent her days in her humble peasant surroundings, but she would don her best white gown in the evenings and thrill the men who admired her in the local fandangos. The young men anxiously waited for her arrival, and she reveled in the attention that she would receive. However, La Llorona had 2 small sons who made it very difficult for her to spend her evenings out, and she often left them alone while she spent time with the gentlemen in the evenings. One day, the 2 small boys were found drowned in the river. Some say they drowned through her neglect, but others say that they may have died by her own hand. Another legend says that La Llorona was a caring woman, full of life and love, who married a wealthy man who lavished her with gifts and attention. However, after she bore him 2 sons, he changed, returning to a life of womanizing and alcohol, often leaving her for months at a time. He seemingly no longer cared for the beautiful Maria, even talking about leaving her to marry a woman of his own wealthy class. When he did return home, it was only to visit his children, and the devastated Maria began to feel resentment toward the boys. One evening, as Maria was strolling with her 2 children on a shady pathway near the river, her husband came by in a carriage with an elegant lady beside him. He stopped and spoke to the children but ignored Maria completely, and then drove the carriage down the road without looking back. After seeing this, Maria went into a terrible rage, and turning against her children, she seized them and threw them into the river. As they disappeared downstream, she realized what she had done and ran down the bank to save them, but it was too late. Maria broke down into inconsolable grief, running down the streets screaming and wailing. The beautiful La Llorona mourned them day and night. During this time, she would not eat and walked along the river in her white gown, searching for the boys, hoping they would return to her. She cried endlessly as she roamed the riverbanks and her gown became soiled and torn. When she refused to eat, she grew thinner and appeared taller until she looked like a walking skeleton. Still a young woman, She finally died on the riverbanks alone. Not long after her death, her restless spirit began to appear, walking the banks of the Santa Fe River when darkness fell. Her weeping and wailing became a curse of the night, and people began to be afraid to go out after dark. She was said to have been seen drifting between the trees along the shoreline, or floating along the current with her long white gown spread out upon the waters. On many a dark night, people would see her walking the riverbank and crying for her children, and so they no longer spoke of her as Maria, but as La Llorona, the weeping woman. Children are warned not to go out after dark, for La Llorona might snatch them, throwing them to their deaths in the flowing waters. Though the legends vary, the apparition is said to act without hesitation or mercy. The tales of her cruelty depend on the version of the legend you hear. Some say that she kills indiscriminately, taking men, women, and children, whoever is foolish enough to get close enough to her. Others say that she's very barbaric and kills only children, dragging them screaming to a watery grave. La Llorona has been heard at night wailing next to rivers by many, and her wanderings have grown wider, following Hispanic people wherever they go. Her movements have been traced throughout the Southwest and as far north as Montana on the banks of the Yellowstone River. The Hispanic people believe that the weeping woman will always be with them, following the many rivers looking for her children. For this reason, many of them fear the dark and pass the legend from generation to generation. What list would this be of the Old West without mentioning Tombstone, Arizona, said to be one of the most haunted places in the United States? Tombstone's most famous place, the OK Corral, was the site of the best-known gunfight in the Old West. Portrayed in dozens of Western films and books, the gunfight made a legend of Wyatt Earp and brought Tombstone, Arizona fame. After tensions had been building between the Earps and the cowboy faction in Tombstone, for some time Marshal Virgil Earp determined to disarm the men on October 26, 1881. This resulted in a 30-second shootout which left Frank and Tom McLaury, as well as Billy Clanton, dead. Also involved in the gunfight for the Cowboys were the like of Ike Clanton, Billy Claiborne, and Wes Fuller. In the Earp party were the brothers Virgil, Wyatt, and Morgan, as well as Doc Holliday. Today, the OK Corral is allegedly haunted by the Cowboys' ghosts over the years. Several witnesses have reported seeing the fading apparitions of men dressed in cowboy attire, often appealing with guns drawn, perhaps locked in a perpetual battle with the Earps. Others have claimed to felt numerous cold spots in various areas of the corral. At the nearby Boot Hill Graveyard, called such because many of its occupants died with their boots on, more than 250 graves give partial stories of the Tombstone's lawless past. Used primarily from 1878 to 1884, the graveyard was originally called the Tombstone Cemetery. Men such as those killed at the OK Corral gunfight, Marshal Fred White killed by Curly Bill, an unfortunate soul by the name of George Johnson who was hanged by mistake, 5 men hanged for their vicious killings labeled the Bisbee Massacre, and gunfighter Charlie Storms who was killed by Luke Short, are some of the people who were laid to rest here. There are dozens more, ranging from prospectors to outlaws, lawmen, and prostitutes. Their names were never known, or were only ever known by a nickname. Over the years, the old cemetery fell into disrepair, with numerous old wooden tombstones falling or decomposing entirely, and others being stolen by souvenir hunters. It wasn't until the town's first El Dorado days, around 1929, that the old cemetery began to be referred to as the Boot Hill Graveyard. Still, it continued to sit neglected until the 1940s when an effort began to restore the cemetery. Today, it's one of Tombstone's most popular tourist attractions. Evidently, per several legends, it also remains popular with the many dead who lie there. Visitors often report seeing strange lights and hearing unidentifiable noises coming from the old graveyard. Spirits have been spied on numerous occasions, and even more frequently are said to appear in photographs. Billy Clanton, killed in the gunfight at the OK Corral, is said to rise from his grave before walking along the road back to Tombstone. One of the oldest original buildings in Tombstone and most authentic attractions in this once booming mining camp, the Birdcage Theater, also has the reputation as being the most haunted place in town, allegedly continuing to host as many as 31 ghosts. The birdcage was named for its 14 small, quote, cribs hanging from the ceiling that once housed painted ladies dressed as finely feathered birds. After its opening in 1881, it quickly gained a reputation as the wildest place in town. So much so that even the faraway New York Times said of it, quote, "The Birdcage Theater is the wildest, wickedest night spot between Basin Street and the Barbary Coast." Between 1881 and 1889, the Birdcage never closed its doors 24 hours a day, as it provided gambling, drinking, and other vices to its many customers. The saloon was the scene of 26 deaths, which can be attested to by the 140 bullet holes which can still be viewed at the Birdcage today. Since 1934, the old building has served as a museum owned and operated by the Hunley family. It still houses the gilded cages, hand-painted stage, and the original grand piano. Here, where the tourists can walk along the floors of this historic honky-tonk, once walked the likes of Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday. Seemingly, some of these old legends of the past continue to stalk the old saloon, as both staff and guests alike have reported seeing ghostly apparitions in the 1800s clothing. Most often cited is the figure of a male stagehand that appears wearing black striped pants, a visor, and holding a clipboard as he walks across the stage. Other occurrences include the sounds of roaring laughter and music pouring from the old theater's doors at night. Others report hearing the faint sounds of a woman singing, and the museum's sound system is inexplicably turned on of its own accord, blaring old-time music. Others have reported strange sounds coming from the main floor's balconies and the sharp scents of cigar smoke and whiskey. After closing time, the staff has reported hearing the sounds of clinking glass and cards shuffling. The haunting reports date back to 1921, when a school was built across the street and students began to report the sounds of laughter and music coming from the abandoned building, as well as the smell of cigar smoke. Over the years, the Hunley family, staff, and visitors alike have experienced several strange events. One of the fascinating tales is how a dice table, which weighed several hundred pounds, mysteriously moved the night before. When staff arrived the next morning, the table had been moved in front of a door with a sign that read, "Don't disturb our 26 resident ghosts." That table was so heavy that it reportedly took 8 men to move it back to its former position. These are just a few of the places in Tombstone, Arizona that hold a haunting history. Felipe Espinoza was a petty criminal who deeply resented the movement of Anglo-American settlers into 19th century Colorado. He was also a fanatical member of the Penitentes, a local Catholic brotherhood known for whipping themselves bloody and performing other acts of self-mutilation. When American soldiers tried to arrest him for banditry, Felipe declared his own personal war on the Protestant interlopers. Accompanied by his brother Vivian, and later his nephew Jose, Felipe roamed through the mountains of Colorado, slaughtering every Anglo he came across. Some of the bodies were found with a cross carved into their chest. Felipe wrote taunting letters to the governor, telling him to inquire if anyone had ever, quote, "killed as many men as the Espinosas. We have killed 32. Despite a massive manhunt, which eventually killed Vivian Espinoza, Felipe remained elusive. In a letter to his wife, he boasted, "They have hands and cannot touch me. They have feet and cannot catch me. They have eyes and cannot see me. They have ears and cannot hear me." The desperate government finally hired the famed mountain man Tom Tobin, who tracked Felipe and Jose Espinoza through the Sangre de Cristos and personally killed both of them in a bloody battle near the summit of Mount Mestas. Tobin then returned to Fort Garland and collected his bounty by dumping Felipe Espinoza's severed head in front of the shocked colonel who had hired him. In 1870, 4 people settled in Labette County, Kansas, not far from where a young Laurel Ingalls Wilder lived with her parents. They called themselves the Benders and claimed to be a family, although the exact nature of their relationship would be later questioned. Ma and Pa Bender spoke only German, but their children were fluent in English, and the family soon turned their one-bedroom shack into a small inn. They were rumored to practice magic, and Kate Bender became popular, locally known as the fortune teller and spiritualist. In the years that followed, settlers began to vanish while traveling through Labette County. Body parts began to turn up in the countryside, but nobody knew who was to blame. Eventually, the locals had a meeting and agreed to form a party to search every house in the area, but this was delayed by bad weather. When the party finally reached the Bender place, the family was long gone. Underneath the bed, a trapdoor led to a secret basement, where the floor was stained with blood. 8 bodies were found buried in the garden, each with a cut throat and smashed skull. The Benders were never found, and it's unknown how many more victims they've claimed over the years. Collecting souvenirs is a traditional part of traveling. Every good tourist spot offers plenty of things for tourists to take home, either to remember their own trip or to share it with those who couldn't come along. But some tourists don't want to settle for the t-shirts and trinkets in the gift shop. Visitors have been stealing bits of Arizona's Petrified Forest National Park for decades. In February of this year alone, a heavy ore car was stolen from Joshua Tree National Park, and the Ahwahnee Hotel sign was stolen from Yosemite. Bodhi State Historic Park, the site of the Wild West ghost town of Bodhi, is no exception. The mining town on the border of California and Nevada was founded in 1877 and abandoned in the 1940s when mining in the region dried up. The state of California took it over and turned it into a park in 1962, and tourists have been stealing artifacts ever since. But here's where Bodhi differs from other parks plagued by pilfering. Many of the artifacts taken from the town are later returned. Rangers at the park regularly receive letters from people who claim to have stolen an item, only to have their luck turn completely sour. Tourists who have taken historical items report that their luck went sharply downhill after their thefts. They attributed car accidents, unemployment, chronic illness, and more to the Bodhi curse. There's even a book called Bad Luck Hot Rocks collecting these letters. In 1996, rangers reported people driving from as far as San Francisco, a 6-hour trip, to return items to the exact place they were taken from. One visitor even stopped to return a nail that punctured her tire as she drove through the town. No one seems to know what's behind the curse, but many people believe that Bodhi puts the ghost in Ghost Town. Visitors to town have reported seeing strange lights and hearing spectral music. One ranger said he'd never seen, heard, or smelled any of the strange things others do, but that he does get a strange feeling when working on the buildings. Is Bodhi really haunted or cursed? Logic says no, but logic also says it's probably best not to steal anything when visiting the old mining town. Among the sandstone columns of the Colorado foothills stood the lodge of Tangaro, or First Falling Thunder. Though swift in the chase and brave in battle, he seldom went abroad with neighboring tribes, for he was happy in the society of his wife, Zecana, or the bird. He often went with her to a post on the New Mexico frontier to sell beaver and wild sheepskins. While at this fort, a Spanish trader saw the pretty Zecana and, determining to win her, sent the Indian on a mission into the heart of the mountains with a promise that she should rest securely at the settlement until his return. On his way, Tangaro stopped at the spring in Manitou, and after drinking, he cast beads and wampum into the well in oblation to its deity. The bubbling water flung out the offering, and as he stated, distressed at this unwelcome omen, a picture formed on the surface, the anguished features of Zecana. He ran to his horse, galloped away, and paused neither for rest nor food till he reached the post. The Spaniard was gone. Turning then to the foothills, he urged his tired horse towards his cabin and arrived, one bright morning, flushed with joy to see his wife before his door and to hear her singing. When he spoke, she looked up carelessly and resumed her song. She did not know him. Reason was gone. It was of his cry of rage and grief when from her babbling, Tangaro learned of the Spaniard's betrayal that brought the wandering mind back for an instant. Looking at her husband with a strange surprise and pain, she plucked the knife from his belt. Before realizing her purpose, she had thrust it into her heart and had fallen dead at his feet. For hours he stood there stunned, but the stoic Indian nature soon resumed its sway. Setting his lodge in order and feeding his horse, he wrapped Zecana's body in buffalo skin and then slept through the night in sheer exhaustion. 2 nights afterward, the Indian stood in the shadow of a room in the trading fort and watched the Spaniard as he lay asleep. Nobody knew how he had passed the guard. In the small hours, the trader was roused by the strain of a belt across his mouth, and leaping up to fling it off, he felt the tug of a lariat at his throat. His struggles were useless. In a few moments, he was bound hand and foot. Lifting some strips of bark from the low roof, Tangaro pushed the Spaniard through the aperture and lowered him into the ground, outside the enclosure of which the house formed part. Then, at the embers of a fire, he kindled an arrow wrapped in the down of cottonwood and shot it into a haystack in the court. In the smoke and confusion thus made, his escape was unseen, safe by a guardsman drowsily pacing his beat outside the square of buildings. The sentinel would have given the alarm had not the Indian pounced on him like a panther and laid him dead with a knife stroke. Catching up with the Spaniard, the Indian tied him to the back of a horse and set off beside him. Thus they journeyed until they came to his lodge, where he released the traitor from his horse and fed him, but kept his hands and legs hardbound and paid no attention to his questions and his appeals for liberty. Tying a strong and half-trained horse at his door, Tangaro placed a wooden saddle on him, cut off the Spaniard's clothes, and put him astride of the beast. After he had fastened him into his seat with deerskin thongs, he took Zakana's corpse from its wrapping and tied it to his prisoner, face to face. Then, loosening the horse, which was plunging and snorting to be rid of his burden, he saw him rush off in the endless desert and followed him on his strong steed. At first, the Spaniard fainted. He struggled to get free on recovering, but his struggles only brought him closer to the dreadful thing before him. Noonday heat covered him with sweat, and blood dripped from the wales that the cords cut in his flesh. At night, he froze uncovered in the chill air, and for an instant his eyes closed to sleep, but a curse yelled in his ear and awoke him. Tangaro gave him a drink from time to time, but never food. So they rode for days. At last, hunger overbore his loathing, and sinking his teeth into the dead flesh before him, he feasted like a ghoul. Still they rode, Tangaro never far from his victim, on whose sufferings he gloated until a gibbering cry told him that the Spaniard had gone mad. Then, and not until then, he drew rein and watched the horse with its dead and manic riders until they disappeared in the yellow void. He turned away but never more sought his home. To and fro, through the brush, the sand, the alkali of the plains, go the ghost riders, forever.